The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my son's voice boomed across the Dallas Country Club ballroom. $8,000 a month, Michael announced, his arm heavy on my shoulder like a chain. That's what I give my father so he can live with dignity after everything he's sacrificed for me. The room erupted in applause. Crystal clinked against crystal. Faces glowed with admiration under the chandeliers. But my coffee that morning had been instant, stretched thin with tap water. My Ford outside wheezed through another December night because the heater died 3 months ago, and 3 months of $8,000 should have bought 10 new heaters. I stood there in Harold Peterson's borrowed suit, the sleeves hanging past my knuckles, watching my life become a lie wrapped in applause. At 57, you learn that betrayal doesn't announce itself with shouting. It arrives in a tuxedo, raises a glass, and asks a room full of strangers to celebrate your humiliation. The crystal chandelier above us cast everything in golden light, making even the lie look beautiful. Michael's wife, Sophia, glided between tables in her black cocktail dress, touching elbows and whispering gratitudes. Her smile was sharp as winter when it landed on me, daring me to contradict the fairy tale my son was spinning. But what happened next wiped every smile from every face in that room. The country club smelled like money and fresh flowers, the kind of place where silence costs extra and truth gets checked at the door. I'd scrubbed warehouse floors since 4 that morning, my knees still aching from the concrete, my hands still carrying the ghost scent of industrial cleaner despite 3 washings. The jacket pinched my shoulders. Harold from 3B had loaned it to me when Michael called yesterday, voice tight with the kind of urgency that makes fathers drop everything. "Dad, I need you at the investor dinner tomorrow night. It's important." Important. The word tasted different now as I watched him work the room like a politician. His confidence polished bright as his cufflinks. He looked like success, moved like money, spoke like a man who'd never counted quarters for laundry soap. "Richard has always been my inspiration." Michael continued, his grip on my shoulder tightening. "Even now at his age, he refuses to just sit back. He volunteers at the shelter, mentors young men trying to get their lives together." More applause. I hadn't been to a shelter in 6 months, not since my shift supervisor added Saturday mornings to my warehouse schedule. Young men I might mentor if I wasn't too tired to form complete sentences after pulling double shifts. Sophia appeared beside us like smoke, her perfume sharp enough to cut through the industrial bleach still clinging to my skin. "Richard's so modest," she purred to the circle of executives. "He never talks about the allowance. Classic Depression-era generation, you know. They're not comfortable discussing money." The Depression. I was born in 1967. But the crowd nodded knowingly, as if my imaginary trauma explained my imaginary humility about my imaginary windfall. Margaret Walsh from Michael's business board leaned forward, pearls catching the light. $8,000 a month, my goodness, Michael, that's more generous than most pension plans." "Family comes first," Michael said, his voice carrying that practiced sincerity that sealed deals and opened wallets. "When your parent sacrifices everything to give you opportunities, you pay it back with interest." Interest. The word hung in the air like incense. I thought of the notice from the electric company in my jacket pocket, the one threatening disconnection if I couldn't scrape together another $47 by Friday. $8,000 a month would have bought me a house, a car. That started in cold weather groceries that didn't come from the discount bin. Instead, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment where the neighbors' arguments leaked through walls thin as paper, where I heated soup on a hot plate because the stove died last winter, and $8,000 had never appeared to replace it. The crowd was moving now, drifting toward dessert tables laden with petit fours that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Michael's hand finally left my shoulder, leaving a warm spot that felt like a brand. "Excuse me," I said to no one in particular, my voice barely audible above the jazz quartet in the corner. I walked toward the terrace doors, legs steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. The December air hit my face like honesty, cold and sharp. The Dallas skyline glittered beyond the club's manicured gardens, 1,000 windows holding other people's warm, well-lit lives. I pulled the door shut behind me and leaned against the stone railing, finally allowing my hands to shake. My phone buzzed. A text from the electric company. Final notice. $47 might as well have been $47,000. Tomorrow I'd call them, explain about the disconnect fee, beg for another week. It was a conversation I'd had with too many companies, a dance I'd learned too well. The terrace door opened behind me. Sophia's heels clicked against the stone like a countdown. "Richard." Her voice was silk wrapped around steel. "You look pale." Perhaps the excitement was too much. I turned to face her. In the moonlight, her beauty looked carved from ice, all sharp angles and calculated curves. "I don't recall being excited." She tilted her head, studying me like a chess problem. "Michael worries about you, you know. He often says how difficult it must be managing all that money at your age. Sometimes people forget where they've put things. I haven't forgotten anything." "Haven't you?" She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. $8,000 is quite a lot to misplace. Perhaps it's in some account you've forgotten about, some trust arrangement Michael set up that slipped your mind. The lie was beautifully constructed. I had to admire the craftsmanship. A confused old man, a devoted son, a trust account gathering dust somewhere while I pretended poverty for attention. It was almost believable. "There is no trust account," I said quietly. Her smile never wavered. "Are you certain? Because Michael has all the paperwork. Bank statements, transfer records, everything properly documented. It would be unfortunate if there were any confusion about the arrangements." The threat sat between us like a third person. I looked past her through the glass doors at Michael, still holding court, still basking in applause meant for fictional generosity. Still my son despite everything. "A family is everything, Richard." Sophia continued, her voice soft as poison. "It would be such a shame if anything disrupted that harmony, especially over something as simple as a misunderstanding about paperwork." She walked away, then heels clicking like a typewriter, recording some final statement. I stood alone on the terrace for another 20 minutes, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air, each exhalation a small ghost of the man I used to be. When I finally returned inside, the party was winding down. Guests clustered around the coat check, voices warm with wine and satisfaction. They'd witnessed something beautiful tonight, a son honoring his father, a family that understood the value of gratitude. Michael found me near the door. "Dad, thanks for coming tonight. I know these things aren't really your scene, but it meant a lot having you here." He hugged me, and for a moment I smelled his childhood in his hair, remembered the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder during long car rides. That boy had grown into this man who could lie about love while looking me in the eyes. "The investors were impressed," he continued. "Peterson especially. He mentioned how much he respects family values." Family values. The phrase tasted like copper pennies, the flavor of fear and shame mixed together. I nodded and smiled and played my part until the very end. Until I was walking across the parking lot toward my rusted Ford while Michael and Sophia drove away in their BMW taillights, disappearing into the Texas night. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, letting the cold seep through Harold's borrowed jacket. The radio crackled to life when I turned the key, some late-night DJ spinning songs about heartbreak and second chances. I turned it off and drove home in silence, past billboards advertising lives I'd never live, past windows glowing with warmth I'd never feel. Back in my apartment, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the electric bill. $47. In $8,000 a month, that was roughly 4 hours worth of my fictional allowance. But in my real life, it might as well have been the distance to the moon. I opened my laptop, the old Dell that wheezed like my car, and logged into my bank account. The numbers glowed back at me, cold and mathematical. No mysterious deposits, no trust transfers, no $8,000. Just the truth, small and stubborn as a weed growing through concrete. The morning after the country club, I woke to the sound of water dripping somewhere behind the walls. The apartment building was old enough to have secrets pipes that complained and floors that remembered every footstep from the past 40 years. I made coffee with yesterday's grounds because $8,000 a month was still a fairy tale. And fairy tale money doesn't buy fresh coffee beans. My phone buzzed against the cracked Micha counter. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Stop asking questions that aren't yours to ask." No signature, no name, just a threat wrapped in punctuation. I screenshot the message and saved it to a folder I'd started calling evidence, though I wasn't sure yet what I was gathering evidence for. The folder sat next to another one labeled bills, which told a different story about my monthly income. At the warehouse, Jimmy Martinez was already hosing down the loading dock when I arrived at 4 a.m. 23 years old, 2 kids and a wife who worked nights at the hospital. He looked up when my Ford coughed to a stop in the parking lot. "Rough night, Mr. Bell?" he asked, coiling the hose with practiced efficiency. "Long one, I said, pulling on my work gloves. The left one had a hole near the thumb that I'd been meaning to patch for 3 months. $8,000 would have bought a lifetime supply of work gloves. We worked in comfortable silence, moving pallets and checking inventory sheets. Jimmy had a rhythm to his work that reminded me of music, each movement flowing into the next. When the morning supervisor arrived at 6, Jimmy was already loading the first truck of the day. "You're gonna make me look bad, Martinez," Frank Williams called out, his coffee steaming in the cold air. "Just trying to stay warm, Mr. Williams," Jimmy replied, but his smile was tired around the edges. I watched Frank check his clipboard, marking off completed tasks with the satisfaction of a man who still believed hard work led somewhere better. I'd been that man once. I'd believed the math would eventually add up, that sacrifices compounded like interest building towards some future payoff. Now I knew better. Sometimes the math was rigged from the start. During my lunch break, I drove to the public library on Elm Street. The computers there were slow but reliable, and the librarian, Mrs. Chen, never asked why a man my age was Googling financial elder abuse and family trust fraud during the lunch rush. The search results painted a picture I didn't want to recognize. Adult children claiming elderly parents as dependents for tax benefits while providing no actual support. Fake trust accounts designed to launder money through family names. Emotional manipulation disguised as financial planning. One article from the Dallas Morning News caught my attention. Local man discovers son using his name for business tax credits. The story was 3 months old, filed under local crime. A retired school principal named Robert Hayes had learned his son's construction company had been claiming him as a supported dependent for 5 years while Robert lived on Social Security in a studio apartment. The comment section below the article was a chorus of similar stories. Daughters redirecting pension checks. Sons forging signatures on loan applications. Adult children who visited once a year but claimed daily caregiving expenses on their taxes. I printed the article and folded it into my wallet next to my driver's license. Evidence of a pattern I was only beginning to understand. Back at the warehouse, I found Frank Williams waiting by my locker. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a man delivering news he didn't want to carry. "Richard, we need to talk," he said. "Someone called asking questions about you. About your schedule, your performance, whether you seemed confused lately." The word hung between us like smoke. Confused about what? Memory issues, financial decision-making. They said they were concerned family members checking on your well-being. Frank's eyes narrowed. Funny thing is, in 15 years of working here, no family members ever called before. My chest tightened. Sophia's threat from the terrace was taking shape, growing teeth. What did you tell them? Told them you're the most reliable employee on the night shift. Told them if they had concerns, they should talk to you directly instead of going behind your back. Frank crossed his arms. But Richard, if someone's trying to cause problems for you, you need to know about it. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything I could remember. The country club speech, the $8,000 claim, Sophia's terrace conversation, the anonymous text, the phone call to Frank. Each detail was a breadcrumb leading deeper into a forest I was only beginning to map. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, knocked around 8 o'clock holding a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel. She was 72, a widow who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. Her smile could warm a room, but her eyes missed nothing. "You look thin, Richard," she said, settling the dish on my counter without waiting for permission. "And tired, more than usual." The casserole smelled like childhood, like the kind of meal someone makes when they have time to care about ingredients. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten something that hadn't come from a can or a drive-through window. "Senora Rodriguez, I don't have to do anything," she interrupted, spooning rice and beans onto a plate. "But I want to. My Carlos always said the measure of a neighborhood is how it treats its people when they're down." She stayed while I ate, asking casual questions about work, about my sleep, about whether I'd heard from Michael lately. Her questions felt like gentle probes, a medical exam disguised as conversation. "You know," she said as I finished the last bite, "my nephew works at a law office downtown, family law, elder care issues. He's always saying how many people don't know their rights when family members start making financial decisions for them." The words landed soft but precise, like darts hitting a target. "What kind of decisions?" "Oh, you know. Setting up accounts, claiming dependents on taxes, handling medical paperwork. Things that sound helpful but maybe aren't so helpful after all." She stood to leave, smoothing her apron with practiced hands. "Sometimes love looks different from the outside than it does from the inside." After she left, I sat with her words echoing in my empty apartment. Love looks different from the outside than it does from the inside. On the outside, Michael's monthly allowance looked like devotion. On the inside, it felt like theft wrapped in a bow. I called information and asked for legal aid services in Dallas. The operator connected me to 3 offices before I found one still answering phones at 9 p.m. A tired-sounding woman named Patricia took my basic information and scheduled a consultation for the following Friday. "Just so you know," she said before hanging up, "if this involves family financial abuse, you'll want to start documenting everything now. Dates, times, witnesses, any written communications. The more detailed, the better. Documentation, evidence." The yellow legal pad suddenly felt less like therapy and more like ammunition. That night, I called in sick to the warehouse for the first time in 2 years. Instead of loading trucks, I drove to the neighborhood where Michael and Sophia lived. Highland Park, where the houses sat on lots the size of football fields and the mailboxes cost more than my monthly rent. Their house was a monument to success, all brick and glass and perfectly manicured landscaping. The BMW sat in the circular driveway next to a white Lexus I hadn't seen before. Lights glowed warm and golden in the windows, painting rectangles of contentment across the lawn. I parked across the street and watched through my cracked windshield. At 10:15, a woman emerged from the front door. Not Sophia, someone older carrying what looked like legal folders. She got into the Lexus and drove away, her headlights sweeping across my face for a moment before disappearing into the night. 15 minutes later, Michael appeared in the kitchen window, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing with his free hand. Even from a distance, his body language looked agitated, stressed. He was talking to someone who wasn't making him happy. I drove home through empty streets, past billboards advertising retirement communities and investment services. "Secure your golden years," one proclaimed. "Family financial planning you can trust," promised another. Trust. The word followed me all the way back to my apartment, where the yellow legal pad waited with its growing list of documented lies. Patricia Valdez's law office occupied the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator wheezed like my car, and the hallway carpet was worn thin by years of people carrying troubles they couldn't solve alone. Patricia herself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every variation of family crisis at least twice. Her handshake was firm, professional, but not unkind. "Tell me what's happening," she said, settling behind a desk scattered with case files and coffee-stained legal pads. I told her everything. The country club speech, the phantom allowance, Sophia's threats, the phone calls to my workplace. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in shorthand that looked like a secret code. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Bell, I need to ask you some difficult questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Do you have any memory issues? Any confusion about dates, places, financial arrangements?" "No." "Any history of mental health treatment, depression, anxiety, anything that could be used to question your competency?" The questions stung, but I understood their necessity. "No. I'm tired, overworked, and apparently stupid enough to believe my son loved me more than he loved money. But I'm not crazy." She smiled at that, the first crack in her professional armor. "Good. Because if they're claiming you're incompetent to discredit your testimony, we need to be prepared." She opened a fresh legal pad and wrote "Bell" at the top in neat block letters. "Now let's talk about documentation. Bank statements, tax returns, any written communications about this supposed allowance. What do you have?" I pulled out the folder I'd started assembling. Bank statements showing no mysterious $8,000 deposits. Screenshots of the threatening text. The printed article about Robert Hayes. My yellow legal pad with its growing timeline of lies. Patricia reviewed each item carefully, making notes and photocopies. When she finished, she looked up with something approaching satisfaction. "This is good, Mr. Bell. Better than most people bring me, but we need more." "More what?" "Evidence of where that money is actually going. If Michael's claiming you as a dependent, there should be bank records, receipts, documentation of support. If he's lying to the IRS, that's federal fraud. If he's using your name without permission, that's identity theft." The words hung in the air like a medical diagnosis. My son wasn't just lying, he was committing crimes, plural, with my name attached to each one. "What do I do next?" I asked. "You become an investigator," Patricia said, handing me a business card. "But carefully. No confrontations, no accusations, no letting them know you're gathering evidence. You document everything, and I mean everything. Every conversation, every text message, every time someone mentions this mysterious allowance." She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder not much bigger than a matchbox. "Texas is a one-party consent state. You can record any conversation you're part of without telling the other person. But be smart about it. Don't wave it around like a flag." The recorder felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with the responsibility of becoming someone I'd never been before. A spy in my own family. "One more thing," Patricia said as I stood to leave. If they've been claiming you as a dependent, they've probably been doing it for years. The IRS keeps records. We can request copies of any tax returns that list you. It might take time, but it'll show the scope of what we're dealing with. Outside her office, the afternoon sun felt different on my face, sharper, more focused. I walked to my car with purpose instead of resignation. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had a plan that belonged to me instead of someone else. That evening, I called Michael. The recorder sat on my kitchen table like a small black witness. "Dad, I was just thinking about you," he said, his voice warm with fabricated affection. "How are you feeling after last night? I know those events can be overwhelming." "I'm fine," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Actually, I had a question about something you mentioned. The $8,000 you said you give me every month." Silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. "What about it?" His voice had cooled by several degrees. "Well, I was balancing my checkbook and I don't see any deposits that large. Maybe they're going to a different account, some kind of trust or savings arrangement." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him thinking, calculating responses. "Dad, we've talked about this. The money goes into the family support account. It's more efficient for tax purposes, and it ensures you're protected from any financial mistakes or confusion." Family support account. The phrase was new, polished, smooth like a river stone. "I don't remember setting up any family support account." "You did, though. Last spring when we updated your estate planning. Remember, we met with the financial advisor, signed all those documents." His voice carried the patient tone adults use with forgetful children. I remembered no such meeting, no financial advisor, no documents. But Michael's confidence was absolute, as if repetition could transform lies into memories. "Maybe I'm confused about the details," I said, playing along. "Could you send me copies of the paperwork? I'd like to review the arrangements." "Of course. I'll have Sophia pull the files together. But Dad, you really don't need to worry about these things. That's why we set up the system in the first place, to take that burden off your shoulders." Burden. The word sat heavy in my chest. My own financial autonomy had become a burden someone else needed to carry. After the call ended, I sat listening to the recording playback through my laptop speakers. Michael's voice sounded different when divorced from his physical presence, more calculated, less spontaneous. The lies were clearer in audio, stripped of the emotional camouflage that made them palatable in person. I labeled the file Call 1-1115 and saved it to my growing evidence folder. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize. I researched public records online, learning that financial documents often left trails that amateur criminals didn't know existed. I visited the county courthouse and discovered that property deeds, tax liens, and business registrations were all matters of public record. Michael's name appeared on several interesting documents. A limited liability company called MB Holdings, registered 6 months after his marriage to Sophia. A luxury condo purchased for cash in downtown Dallas, titled under the same LLC. Business loan applications that listed me as a supported dependent, guaranteeing him lower interest rates and better terms. Each discovery felt like finding another tumor in a body I'd thought was healthy. I also discovered that Sophia's name appeared on documents predating their marriage. Credit applications, rental agreements, business partnerships that had ended in litigation. Her financial history read like a roadmap of other people's money being redirected into her accounts. The pattern was becoming clear. She was the architect. He was the willing accomplice, and I was the raw material they'd use to build their comfortable lies. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door one evening, carrying another casserole and a manila envelope. "My nephew asked me to give you this," she said, settling the food on my counter with practiced efficiency. "He said to read it when you have privacy and quiet time." Inside the envelope was a photocopied legal brief from a case in Houston. A son had been claiming his elderly mother as a dependent while she lived in subsidized housing, eating one meal a day to stretch her Social Security benefits. The son had been convicted of federal tax fraud and ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties. A handwritten note was clipped to the brief. These cases are more common than people think. The key is documentation and credible witnesses. If you need help, call me. Roberto Martinez Esqui. I folded the papers carefully and added them to my evidence folder, which was growing thick enough to need rubber bands. That night I lay awake listening to the building's familiar sounds, water moving through pipes, footsteps in the apartment above the distant hum of traffic on the highway. But underneath it all, I could hear something new, the sound of my own story changing, shifting from tragedy to something that might eventually resemble justice. Tomorrow I would call Roberto Martinez. I would start building a case that could stand up in court, not just in my kitchen. I would transform from victim to plaintiff, from someone having his life stolen to someone fighting to get it back. The yellow legal pad on my nightstand held 3 pages of documented evidence, now written in my careful handwriting. Facts and dates and quotes that added up to a mathematical proof of betrayal. But mathematics, I was learning, could be a weapon as well as a wound. Roberto Martinez's office was nothing like Patricia's worn-down space. Glass and steel leather furniture, a view of downtown Dallas that probably cost more per month than I made in a year. But Roberto himself was comfortable as old shoes with calloused hands and a smile that suggested he remembered where he came from. "My aunt's been worried about you," he said, pouring coffee from a pot that looked like it cost more than my monthly groceries. "She's got good instincts about people in trouble." We spread my evidence across his conference table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Bank statements, tax records, recorded conversations, property documents. 3 months of investigation laid out under fluorescent lights that made everything look sharper, more real. Roberto reviewed each item with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining X-rays. When he finished, he leaned back and whistled low. "Mr. Bell, your son and daughter-in-law have been running a sophisticated fraud operation using your identity. We're looking at tax fraud, identity theft, filing false documents with federal agencies." He tapped the property records with one finger. "This condo purchase alone represents money laundering if they used fraudulently obtained tax benefits to finance it." The words should have felt like victory, but they tasted like sawdust in my mouth. My son was a criminal. My name had been his weapon. "What happens next?" I asked. "We have 2 paths: civil litigation to recover damages and stop the fraud, or criminal referral to federal authorities for prosecution." Roberto's expression grew serious. "If we go criminal, Mr. Bell, there's no controlling the outcome. Your son could go to prison." The room went quiet except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. I thought of Michael as a boy building towers with wooden blocks and crying when they fell down. I thought of him in his tuxedo lying to a room full of strangers with my name in his mouth. "What would you do?" I asked. "I'd want justice," Roberto said without hesitation. "But I'm not his father." That night I sat at my kitchen table with Mrs. Rodriguez's latest casserole growing cold beside my elbow. The decision felt too big for my small apartment, too heavy for one person to carry. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Dad, we need to talk. Can you come to dinner tomorrow night? Sophia's making your favorite." My favorite. He didn't even know what my favorite meal was. Hadn't known since he was 10 years old, and we used to share pizza on Friday nights back when my presence in his life was desired instead of performed. I typed back, "What time?" The next evening I drove to Highland Park with the digital recorder in my shirt pocket and 3 months of evidence locked in my car trunk. The house looked the same from the outside, successful, untouchable, built on foundations I was only beginning to understand. Sophia answered the door in an apron that looked like it had never seen actual cooking, her smile bright as fresh paint. "Richard, I'm so glad you could come. I hope you're hungry." The dining room table was set with china that probably cost more per plate than I made in a week. Candles flickered in silver holders. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. It was a stage set for reconciliation, every detail calculated to suggest warmth and family harmony. Michael emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine that looked older than me. He hugged me with the kind of enthusiasm that felt practiced, performed for an audience of his own conscience. "You look good, Dad, rested. That's what I like to see." We ate small talk and perfectly prepared salmon while I listened for anything that might be useful in court. Sophia dominated the conversation with stories about charity work and social events, painting herself as a pillar of community involvement. Michael nodded along, playing the role of devoted husband. It wasn't until dessert that the real conversation began. "Dad," Michael said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision, "Sophia and I have been talking and we're concerned about you." "Concerned? How?" Sophia leaned forward, her expression molded into maternal sympathy. "Well, you seem confused lately. About financial arrangements, about conversations we've had. It's perfectly normal at your age, but we want to make sure you're protected." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Present concern as love, confusion as incompetence, protection as control. "I'm not confused," I said quietly. Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad, you called last week asking about money that we've already explained. The family support account, the tax arrangements, the trust structures. We've been over this multiple times. I've never seen any paperwork for these arrangements." "Of course you have. We've shown you the documents several times. You just forget." His voice carried a note of sad patience, the tone of a son watching his father slip away. Sophia reached across the table and patted my hand with false affection. "Richard, we think it might be time to consider some additional help. Someone to assist with financial decisions, medical appointments, daily living tasks. A caregiver. Someone to watch me, manage me, keep me from asking inconvenient questions about money that had never existed." "I don't need help," I said. "But you do," Michael insisted. "And we're prepared to provide it. Full-time assistance, a nice facility with people your age, activities and social interaction. You wouldn't have to worry about bills or cooking or maintaining an apartment. Everything taken care of. A facility, not help imprisonment, not care erasure." I reached into my shirt pocket and set the digital recorder on the table between the candles and the crystal glasses. The small black device looked like a bug that had wandered onto the white tablecloth. "What is that?" Sophia asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Insurance," I said. "Against anyone claiming I'm confused about this conversation." Michael stared at the recorder as if it might explode. "Dad, you can't record us without permission. That's illegal." "Actually, it's not. Texas is a one-party consent state. I can record any conversation I'm part of." I smiled at him, the same smile I'd used when he was 5 and trying to convince me he hadn't drawn on the walls with crayons. "Roberto Martinez explained the law to me very thoroughly." Sophia's face had gone white as the china. "Who is Roberto Martinez?" "My attorney, Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew. He's been helping me understand federal fraud statutes, identity theft laws, tax evasion penalties." I kept my voice conversational as if discussing the weather. Fascinating reading, really. Michael's hand was shaking as he reached for his wine glass. "Dad, I think you're overreacting to a simple misunderstanding." $8,000 a month isn't a misunderstanding, Michael. It's a lie you told to a room full of people to make yourself look generous while I eat canned soup and count quarters for laundry. The recorder sat between us like a small black judge, documenting every word, every pause, every breath that carried the weight of 3 years' worth of theft dressed up as family support. "Where does the money go?" I asked. "The money you claim to give me every month. The tax deductions you take for supporting a dependent parent. Where does it actually go?" Silence stretched across the elegant dining room like a fault line. "It goes into investments," Sophia said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Long-term planning for your future security." "What investments? What accounts? What banks?" I pulled a folded paper from my jacket pocket. "Because according to this report from Roberto's forensic accountant, no money has ever been set aside in my name for anything." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. We've been nothing but generous to you, and this is how you repay us, by hiring lawyers and making accusations." "I repay generosity with gratitude," I said, standing as well. "But I repay theft with justice." Sophia was on her feet now too, her mask of concern finally slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. "You ungrateful old fool, do you have any idea what we've done for you? The reputation we've built for you. The respect you command because of our efforts." "Respect built on lies isn't respect," I said. "It's just another kind of theft." I picked up the recorder and slipped it back into my pocket. The evidence was captured now, their own words condemning them more effectively than any accusation I could make. "You can't prove anything," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photograph, the property records for the downtown condo purchased for cash 6 months after their marriage, titled under the same LLC that had claimed me as a dependent for tax benefits. "Actually, I can prove everything. Bank records, tax documents, property transfers, recorded conversations. Roberto calls it a document-rich environment for prosecution." Michael sank back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Sophia remained standing, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you want?" she asked. It was the first honest question either of them had asked me in years. "I want my name back," I said. "I want the lies to stop. I want restitution for every dollar you've stolen and every tax benefit you've claimed fraudulently. And if we refuse—" I walked toward the door, my footsteps loud in the sudden quiet. "Then Roberto makes a phone call to the IRS and the FBI, and you explain everything to a federal judge instead of to me." I left them sitting in their perfectly appointed dining room with the candles still flickering and the classical music still playing softly from hidden speakers. The stage set for reconciliation had become the scene of a reckoning. Outside in my rusted Ford, I sat for a moment listening to my own heartbeat. The recorder in my pocket felt warm against my chest, heated by the proximity to lies finally exposed to light. For the first time in 3 months, I wasn't tired. I wasn't defeated. I wasn't invisible. I was dangerous. The call came at dawn 3 days later, jarring me awake with the violence of bad news delivered without warning. Roberto's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Bell, we have a problem. Sophia filed a police report yesterday claiming you threatened her with a recording device and demanded money. She's alleging elder abuse, you abusing her." I sat up in bed, the morning light filtering through my thin curtains like accusation. "That's insane. It's also strategic. She's trying to muddy the waters before we can file charges, make you look like an unreliable narrator with a grudge." Roberto's voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen every variation of human cruelty dressed up as justice. "The good news is her story doesn't hold up. The bad news is we need to move faster than planned." Ugh. By 10 a.m., I was back in his glass tower office watching him arrange documents with the precision of a general planning a battle. The evidence we'd gathered looked different under fluorescent lights, more official, more damning, more final. "Here's what's going to happen," Roberto said, spreading photographs across his desk. "I'm filing a criminal complaint with the FBI this afternoon. Tax fraud, identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, the works." The photographs showed everything: Michael's tax returns claiming me as a dependent while I lived on warehouse wages, bank transfers moving money through shell companies, property purchases funded by fraudulent deductions. 3 years of systematic theft documented in black and white. "Once the feds get involved, there's no controlling the timeline," Roberto continued. "They'll want to interview you probably multiple times. They'll want to verify every document, every recording, every claim we make." I studied the photographs, seeing my son's signature on documents that transformed me from a person into a tax deduction. How long? Months, maybe a year. Federal cases move slowly but thoroughly. And Mr. Bell? Roberto's expression grew serious. "Once this starts, there's no going back. Your son will likely face federal prison time if convicted." That afternoon, I sat in a sterile conference room in the federal building downtown, facing 2 FBI agents who looked young enough to be Michael's children. Agent Sarah Martinez had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Agent James Cooper took notes in a shorthand that looked like secret code. I told them everything, starting with the country club speech and ending with the dinner table confrontation. They listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or details. When I finished, Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Mr. Bell, I want to be clear about what happens next. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, which means interviewing your son, your daughter-in-law, their accountant, their bank officers. This will become very public very quickly." "I understand." Agent Cooper looked up from his notes. "Are you prepared for the possibility that other family members might side with them? That friends and business associates might see you as the villain in this story?" I thought about the country club speech, the applause, the warm smiles of people who believed in the fairy tale of Michael's generosity. I've been the villain in their story for 3 years. At least now I'll be the villain with the truth on my side. The investigation moved with the inexorable momentum of federal bureaucracy. Search warrants were executed at Michael's home and office. Bank records were subpoenaed. Computer hard drives were seized and analyzed. I learned about the details from Roberto, who received regular updates from the agents assigned to the case. Michael and Sophia had hired expensive defense attorneys who specialized in white-collar crime. Their strategy was predictable: claim everything was a misunderstanding, blame their accountant for any irregularities, paint me as a confused old man seeking attention. The local news picked up the story 3 weeks after the FBI began their investigation. Local businessman accused of defrauding elderly father ran as the lead story on Channel 8's evening broadcast. They used Michael's corporate headshot and a photograph of me that must have been taken from social media, both of us smiling at some long-forgotten family gathering. The reporter was young and earnest, treating the story with the kind of breathless gravity that television reserves for scandal. She interviewed Roberto on the courthouse steps, and I watched from my living room as he explained federal fraud statutes with the patient precision of a teacher addressing slow students. "This case represents a growing problem in America," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Adult children exploiting their elderly parents' identities for financial gain while providing no actual support. It's theft disguised as family care, and it's more common than people realize." My phone began ringing that evening and didn't stop for 3 days. Reporters wanting interviews, neighbors expressing shock, former co-workers offering support. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at my door with a casserole and a fierce expression. You did the right thing, she said, unpacking food with the aggressive efficiency of someone who'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands. My Carlos always said the hardest battles are the ones you fight with family, but sometimes family forgets what family means. The most difficult call came on a Thursday evening while I was reading Roberto's latest update about plea negotiations. Patricia Valdez's voice was careful, measured, carrying news she didn't want to deliver. Mr. Bell, I thought you should know Michael's attorneys have filed a motion claiming you lack mental capacity to make legal decisions. They're asking for a competency hearing. The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything, they were still trying to paint me as confused, incompetent, unreliable. Based on what evidence? I asked. Testimony from Sophia about your recent behavior. Claims that you've become paranoid, aggressive, unable to manage basic finances. They're saying the stress of aging has made you susceptible to manipulation by unscrupulous lawyers. Unscrupulous lawyers. The phrase would have been funny if it weren't so calculated. Transform Roberto and Patricia from advocates into predators, me from victim into victim, just a different kind of victim, one whose victimization was his own fault. What do? We fight it. Medical evaluation, psychiatric assessment, cognitive testing. We prove you're as sharp as you've ever been, just tired of being lied to. The competency hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a courthouse that smelled like floor wax and old disappointments. I sat at a table with Roberto and Patricia, facing a judge who looked like she'd seen every variation of human weakness and found none of them particularly surprising. Michael's attorney was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases other people thought were unwinnable. She spoke about my declining mental state and increasing paranoia with the concerned tone of a daughter worried about her father's well-being. She called Sophia as a witness. Under oath, my daughter-in-law testified that I had become increasingly confused over the past year, forgetting conversations, misplacing bills, becoming agitated when reminded about financial arrangements we'd previously agreed upon. He seemed to believe we were stealing from him, she said, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. It broke our hearts to see him so suspicious of the people who love him most. The performance was masterful. If I hadn't been the person she was describing, I might have believed it myself. Then Roberto stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Bell. He began, his voice conversational, almost friendly. You testified that Mr. Bell became confused about financial arrangements you'd previously agreed upon. Can you describe these arrangements in detail? Sophia's confidence flickered. Well, the family support account, the tax planning structures, the trust arrangements. What bank holds the family support account? Michael handles those details. What's the account number? Gee, I don't have that memorized. When was the account opened? I'd have to check the records, Roberto smiled. Mrs. Bell, in your testimony, you stated that Mr. Bell had previously agreed to these arrangements. When did these conversations take place? Over several months, different occasions. Can you name a specific date when Mr. Bell agreed to have $8,000 per month deposited into accounts he's never seen? The courtroom went quiet. Sophia's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The supposed victim of my confusion couldn't provide basic details about the arrangements I was supposedly confused about. Roberto called me to testify in my own defense. I spoke clearly and methodically about my work history, my financial situation, my discovery of the fraud. I recited bank account numbers, tax identification numbers, dates, and amounts with the precision of a man who'd spent months documenting every detail of his own financial life. When Michael's attorney tried to trip me up with questions about dates and details, I pulled out my yellow legal pad and read directly from my notes. Every conversation, every threat, every lie documented in my own handwriting with the kind of obsessive accuracy that only comes from someone who knows he's fighting for his life. The judge took 20 minutes to render her decision. Based on the evidence presented, I find no indication that Mr. Bell lacks the mental capacity to manage his affairs or make legal decisions. This motion is denied. Outside the courthouse, Roberto shook my hand with something approaching admiration. Mr. Bell, I've been practicing law for 15 years and I've never seen anyone more prepared for a competency challenge. Your documentation saved your case. The criminal trial began 6 months later in a federal courthouse that looked like a temple to justice, all marble columns and soaring ceilings and the kind of architecture that suggests the law is bigger than the people who break it. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every detail of the fraud. The recordings were played in open court, my son's voice filling the room with lies about trust accounts and family support systems that existed only in his imagination. The financial evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing no support payments to me, tax returns claiming me as a dependent while I lived on warehouse wages, property purchases funded by fraudulent deductions. The numbers told a story that no amount of testimony could refute. Michael took the stand in his own defense, maintaining his innocence with the kind of desperate sincerity that suggests someone trying to convince himself as much as the jury. He claimed confusion about tax law, reliance on professional advisors, genuine belief that the arrangements were legal and appropriate. The jury didn't buy it. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Tax fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, wire fraud. Michael was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Sophia got 3 years and full restitution, every dollar stolen, plus interest, plus penalties. I sat in the courtroom gallery and watched my son led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume from a play that had closed. He didn't look at me as the marshals escorted him through the door marked federal detention. That night I sat in my small apartment with a glass of wine. Real wine, not the cheap stuff I'd been buying for years, and tried to feel something resembling victory. Justice had been served. The truth had prevailed. The lies had been exposed and punished. But all I felt was tired and empty, like a man who'd won a war by destroying his own country. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked around 9 o'clock, carrying a pot of coffee and the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. We sat at my kitchen table and watched the steam rise from our cups, two people who understood that some victories cost more than defeats. "You did what you had to do," she said finally. I nodded because there wasn't anything else to do. 3 months later, I moved to a small house in a quiet neighborhood where the trees were old enough to provide real shade, and the neighbors minded their own business with the kind of polite distance that breeds genuine community. I kept working at the warehouse, not because I needed the money anymore. The restitution had made me financially comfortable for the first time in my adult life. But because work gives shape to days that might otherwise collapse under the weight of their own emptiness. Roberto visits sometimes, bringing legal papers that need signing and updates about other cases similar to mine. The FBI has opened investigations into dozens of similar schemes across Texas, using my case as a template for recognizing family financial fraud. I've become something of an accidental expert on elder abuse, speaking at conferences and workshops about the warning signs of family financial manipulation. People listen with the kind of attention reserved for survivors of disasters, as if I've returned from a country they hope never to visit. The irony isn't lost on me. Michael's lies about my importance have become true in ways he never intended. I matter now not as a dependent to be claimed on tax returns, but as a voice for people whose own families have turned them into commodities. I keep the yellow legal pad in a frame on my desk, a reminder that documentation defeats deception, that truth written down in careful handwriting can stand up to lies told with confident voices. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed silent, if I'd let the lie live and grown old in its shadow. I might have had a son who called on holidays and a daughter-in-law who sent birthday cards. I might have had invitations to family gatherings and photographs on refrigerators and the comfortable fiction of being loved by people who found me useful. Instead, I have the truth which is colder but more durable than love built on lies. Michael writes occasionally from federal prison. Short letters that arrive in envelopes marked with correctional facility return addresses, asking for forgiveness without admitting fault, requesting understanding without offering accountability. I read them and file them away unanswered. Some bridges once burned should stay that way. But late at night, when the house settles around me with the creaks and sighs of wood that's learned to weather storms, I sometimes take out those old photographs from when Michael was small. Pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and ordinary afternoons when love was simple and honest and required nothing more complicated than showing up. I look at those pictures and remember the father I used to be, the son he used to be, the family we were before. Money taught us to lie to each other with smiles on our faces. Then I put the photographs away and return to the present, where I live alone but not lonely, comfortable but not complacent, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction that comes from choosing truth over peace, justice over family, dignity over the comfortable conspiracy of loving lies. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I chose, and that makes all the difference. The yellow legal pad sits on my desk, no longer needed, but still kept as a reminder. Document everything, trust carefully, and never let anyone turn your name into their lie. Because in the end, that's all any of us really have: our names and the stories we choose to let them tell.